but my job is to help them express it for them, is actually a search for a home. I mean, that's why it's not an ideology. Populism, to me, in the way that I see it, represents a demand to belong. So you know that populism is a bad word. And what's very interesting is that there are numerous reports that have been published by the European Union, all of them which claim the necessity of fighting populism, all of them which argue that populism is a threat to European Union and European society. And you kind of wonder, would they say that about the need to fight conservatism, the dangers of liberalism, or of socialism, or of environmentalism? No, that's not a problem for them. But populism somehow has been isolated as the problem number one, something that represents a threat and a danger. And that, to me, is really seriously important. Because basically what it says is that even though there are governments in the European Union who they call populists, who are member states, have been elected by the people, nevertheless, implicitly, they are regarded as a threat and as a danger to the integrity of the European Union. So it's important to realize that behind the scenes, and sometimes not even behind the scenes, there's a continuous public war, a propaganda war, that's being fought against what they see as populism. And what's more or less happened is that populism, which used to have a respectable root and a respectable reputation in the past, populism has been redefined by definition as the moral equivalent of fascism or authoritarianism. That's how they use it, often interchangeably. And very often when you hear these politicians, they talk about populism and far right as being more or less coterminous. And this is important because one of the biggest problems we have in discussing and understanding populism is that there is a real deceptive way in which language is used. One of the biggest challenges that we face in our society is to gain control of our language, to gain control of our voice, because at the moment, it's the mainstream media and the mainstream political parties that are represented in the Commission that get to decide what words can and cannot be used. And they get to decide what populism really represents. One of the things that has happened, and this is the case even in the academic literature on populism, is that populism is not a neutral word. It's not like saying I'm a conservative or liberalism. Populism is by definition a pejorative concept. To be called a populist is not like an ordinary form of description. To be a populist is to be morally inferior to all the other political movements that are around. That's how the word is used in the academic literature. And one of the things that has occurred is that outside of academia, the negative framing of populism is even stronger. So just listen, for example, to the Belgian politician Charles Michel, not one of my favorite guys that is around. He used to be president of the European Council, and he basically said that today, populism is like a virus. A bit like COVID, it's like a virus. And the implication, therefore, is that this is something you have to destroy. And to quote Michel again, he says, defending our liberal democracies against populism is our first, second, and third obligation. So what you've got here is a very clear idea that populism represents a disease. A disease. It's the diseasing of public life. That's how they would like to sort of basically kind of portray it. And of course, when you have a disease and when you have a virus, then the solution to that is you put it under quarantine, or as they put it so delicately, under a cordon sanitaire. And from their point of view, it makes perfect sense as to why you want to delegitimate populism and make sure that it is not seen as a respectable part of public life. That is something that is conveyed time and time and time again both by the intellectuals, the media, but also by our politicians. And I think that's important for us to bear in mind. Now we come to something that is very confusing. And it certainly confused me for a long time. And what's really confusing is this. Populism is not a term of self-designation. In other words, you don't meet very many people who say, I'm a populist. It's not like saying, I'm a communist, or I'm a conservative, or I'm liberal. Populism is not a form of self-designation. Populism is used today as a term that you attribute to others. In other words, it's the people that call others populists who get to decide how populism is presented. And that's very important to realize that in many respects, there's a fundamental dishonesty about the way that populism is used as a word of description. Because these days, a populist is actually somebody that the sections of the technocratic managerial elites regard as a threat to their own way of life. A populist, from their point of view, is somebody whose values, whose outlook contradicts their own, which is why they are so free with calling everybody a populist. Even people who see themselves in very different ways. So, for example, the Prime Minister of Hungary is called a populist, but he calls himself a politician whose job it is to be what he calls a bourgeois politician, somebody who's trying to build up the old-fashioned bourgeois middle class. He gets to be called a populist. And therefore, I think it's important for us to take a step back and ask the question of why is it that this kind of designation that is attributed to others has been accepted. Everybody uses the word populist, and even myself very often say to my, sort of, that's a populist, or that person is a populist. It's a very tricky thing. I decided in my old age that rather than saying, no, 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 I'm not this, or I'm not that, I decided to embrace populism. And I now call myself a populist for the very simple reason that if you're going to mess with me, and you're going to mess with us, well, you might as well get the situation where I'm messing with you. And rather than being defensive about being called a populist, you kind of flaunt it and throw it in their face. So this is something that we have to bear in mind, that populism, in the way that it's used in everyday language, is an invention created by the opponents of populism, rather than the people that they describe as populists. And that kind of fundamental political dishonesty is something that we often overlook at our cost, because we've got to really understand what the basis of this is altogether. So the question becomes, why do they hate populists so much? I mean, why do they hate populists so much? I mean, look at me, I'm a nice guy. You know, I got a nice family. Yeah, I like good music, I like nice food. You know, what's objectionable about people like me? What is it that they really find a problem, and they feel that they have to have millions of NGOs writing reports criticizing? I mean, there literally are. We kind of did a research project on this, and there are billions, and not exaggerating, billions of euros being spent on organizations running campaigns against populism. This is, you know, and yet there's loads and loads of universities everywhere in Europe who are involved in this project. And it's an interesting notion because as an academic myself, as a professor of sociology, I know that when I get involved in a project, I like to think that I don't know what the conclusion of my research will be. Otherwise, it's not research, right? If you already know the answer before you start, it's not research. But these projects that they have essentially tell the NGOs and tell the university partners that this is what we would like you to say, and this is what we would like you to prove. So your job is to fill in. It's like what children do when they fill in little things and, you know, already have the outline of what is going to be done there. So what is it that they are really worried about when it comes to populism? I think that one of the things that is so important here is that they denounce populism, and they call populism xenophobic or homophobic or Islamophobic or chauvinist, whatever, because the values that some people, some movements are trying to express are values that are very strongly held by ordinary people. These are not really ideological values, but they are values that are very strongly held by people. And they are also values that are antithetical, almost the opposite of what the EU elites actually believe in. In other words, there's a contrast, there's a values contrast between what populists say and what they think. And what's funny, what's really interesting here, is that almost every normative concept that so-called populist movements promote are ones that you could take for granted until not so long ago. They're not exactly unusual values, extreme values. So for example, you take patriotism. You know, I'm old enough to remember that when I was a young kid, being a patriot was okay. It was even cool. You could be a patriot, and it wasn't seen as a particular problem. You could be a patriot and walk around with your flag, and nobody would call you boring. Nobody would call you chauvinist or xenophobic. These days, patriotism is regarded as either a mixed blessing or as actually a problem, as a threat to society. And in a sense, what you've got is a situation where patriotism is often described as a first step towards ethnocentrism, towards xenophobia, and towards fascism. They got this little trick. So the trick that they use to criticize populists is they say, you know, the Holocaust did not begin with the gas chambers. That's what they say. And that sounds very profound. Obviously, it didn't begin with the gas chambers. But what they mean by that is that the Holocaust is almost like the inevitable consequence of, first of all, German patriotism, forgetting the German patriotism of the 1848 revolution, then of nationalism, then of more radical nationalism. And they got this, what I call a teleology of evil. And the evil is that once you're a patriot, then within you, in your soul, there is something that will inexorably lead to the gas chambers. This is an idiot's concept of history, because obviously, you know, what you're doing is you're rewriting history in such a way that every moral and political concept you don't like then becomes the first step towards the Holocaust. It's a kind of misuse of the whole uniqueness of the Holocaust. It's important. But also what it does is kind of distorts history. So patriotism, from their point of view, is dangerous. What's even more dangerous is national consciousness. If you have a strong sense of being English or French or Italian, that's a problem, because national consciousness leads to nationalism. And again, it's interesting because even people in this room, and many people I know in different conservative political parties, are too scared to actually say that I got a strong sense of nation. They're embarrassed. As if somehow it's like a bad smell that you don't want to be kind of complicit in. And to be a nationalist, which used to be normal, you know, nationalism was even strong in the French Revolution, never mind the revolutions of the 19th century. You know, poor old Garibaldi, you know, it suddenly becomes, you know, sort of the prototype of fascism. And in fact, there are people who argue that, you know, Garibaldi was the first step to Mussolini. There's a kind of interesting kind of links that are being made. That's really bad. But it isn't just simply patriotism and nationalism that's bad, any value. So for example, if you're old-fashioned like me and suffer from the prejudice that there's only two biological sexes, I mean, I still think there's only two biological sexes, then you get sort of accused of heteronormativity. And worse still, because once you have heteronormativity, that becomes a prelude to transphobia. So there's a whole vocabulary that's attached to you. And you have to remember, until not so long ago, indeed for thousands and thousands of years, people used to believe that there were only two biological sexes. Now that is seen as a cultural crime, to which you must kind of be apologetic about. So you got that, and then you have all these things like patriotism and citizenship, and even, I was involved in a debate recently with some academics, and I made a point which I thought that, actually, a family and family life was important in and of itself. And I made the mistake of saying that children flourish best when they have two parents. Now, I know that's very prejudiced, and I shouldn't be saying that, that it's good for a child to have a mother and a father, rather than another kind of combination or another way of doing it. But the way I was looked at was like if I had just come from Auschwitz and I'd just taken my brown shirt off and made all these outrageous claims about family life. So basically what I'm really getting at is that there are many, many values that you could take for granted until very recently, and which actually most people believe in, most ordinary people throughout Europe believe in, which populism stands for in their eyes, but which are the opposite to what they think. And they feel threatened by that. They really feel threatened by the fact that people have embraced these ways of being, that there are now people who are prepared to voice all the things that you cannot say. And to that extent, what you're doing is you're challenging the mainstream political movements throughout Europe. So, in a sense, I think it's the fact that they recognize that what so-called populist or populist politicians are saying are actually supported by a significant section of society. A section of society that until now was entirely quiet, who was too scared to say, I believe in this and I believe in that, but are now raising their voice. And you can see that once you have populists saying something, it becomes like the little child who basically said that the emperor has got no clothes. But suddenly, you can see the moral and the intellectual nakedness of the people that represent the European Commission. And it happens very fast. I've just been to England, and I live in England. I have my friends are in England, in a small town in Kent. And that particular town has had a conservative member of parliament since the beginning of writing and reading. It's always been that. I mean, you can run a donkey as long as they had a conservative label on it, and the donkey would probably get into parliament. Now, when I walk around Faversham and I talk to people, one of the remarkable things is that almost everybody I talk to, unless they're like a professor like me or a university lecturer, everybody I talk to says, I'm going to vote for reform. This new party, everybody's going to vote for reform. And suddenly you'll find that this party that did not exist until very recently is suddenly coming first in the opinion polls. More people support reform now than the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. And that's happened like that. And the reason why it's happened like that is because suddenly people feel freer to say what they've been thinking all along, what they've been feeling all along, can suddenly and can now be said. So it's important because what's really happening here is that by raising these issues, by basically saying that it's okay to be against mass migration, it's really okay to be against uncontrolled immigration, it's really okay to feel pride in your nation, it's okay to be religious. It's not an embarrassment. By saying all of these things, you're letting the cat out of the bag, and suddenly the parties that have been able to rule without challenge for decades and decades and decades are unraveling. I mean, one of the interesting things about the rise of populism at the moment is that it's paralleled by the unraveling of all the political parties, all the centrist conservative, all the centrist left-wing parties. I mean, where is Christian democracy in Italy? I don't know. Maybe they're gone on holiday somewhere in California. The CDU in Germany, a very strong party, suddenly it's on the same level as this so-called far-right party. Everywhere you look, you find a similar kind of development, and partially it's because of the rise of populism, by the fact that people are free to say what they really think, and partially it's because these parties have become totally incapable of engaging with the contemporary reality. They become isolated. And what we're seeing is what political scientists call a powerful mood of de-alignment, political de-alignment, where people are just simply fleeing and leaving their political parties. So we have this unprecedented development happening overall. Now, back in the day, the American social commentator, Christopher Lasch, wrote a book. And the book was called The Revolt of the Elite and the Betrayal of Democracy. And the point that Christopher Lasch made was interesting. The point that he made was that it's the elites, in this case the American elites, who have somehow betrayed their own way of life. They're the ones that have decided to detach themselves from their communities. They're the ones that have kind of decided that they no longer support community organizations, that they don't think that solidarity on the ground is all that important. So suddenly the elites in America have decided that they got more in common with the elites in Brussels or in Japan than they do with their own people. And as this kind of globalist phenomenon, these globalist elites have detached themselves, you have a development that has never occurred before. And that development is this, that whereas before, people that were anti-elitist or were kicking up against their elites, at least knew that the people on top, the ones they didn't like, had the same view about the church. They had a similar view about what a family is. They were also patriotic. There was something in common. There were a system of values that bound together these different sections of society. And therefore it meant that in the old days, being against the elites actually was principally economic. It was about the fact that these elites had kept far too much of the resources for themselves, and ordinary people did not have access to those things in the same kind of a way. That was the way it worked beforehand. Today, what we have is a situation where the elites of our societies aren't just simply criticized, or in fact not even criticized that much, for their economic selfishness, but also because they represent a culture that is very, very different. And therefore, the populist reaction that we're seeing is principally a cultural one. It's about a cultural revolt that is occurring against an elite whose views are very, very different than the rest of society. The way to understand what's happened is that in the 1970s, late 1970s, you had a cultural turn. And the cultural turn around 1979, 1980 basically represented that the old values that were very powerful in Europe beforehand were being rejected by environmentalism, by essentially what became woke ideology. It was by kind of a globalist outlook. And under those circumstances, a chasm developed. And that chasm that developed was the terrain on which populism, what we call populism today, began to grow. It's around the early 1980s that you had the first populist parties emerging and developing. You had, for example, in Denmark and Norway, the anti-tax movements. In Italy, you had the Liga emerging, one of the first ones to play a role as a serious populist movement. Gradually, the old Front National, which is now the Rassemblement National, kind of comes in. But it just, it didn't really grow all that much. They were getting like 4%, 5%, 6%. The Liga sometimes got 8%, 9%. But it stayed like as a marginal movement. And it could easily be dismissed as a protest party. That's what they called them, a protest party that you didn't need to take seriously. But then what happened is that through a succession of events, from about the 1990s onwards, the old political movements, the old political parties, began to gradually explode and implode. And under those circumstances, a lot of these parties, for the first time, could begin to really be serious. Two things happened. First of all, the left, the communist and the socialist left, which used to have the support of ordinary people in France, Italy, and elsewhere, the old left decided to go on holiday and basically gave up being left. So these days, you don't have left-wing people anymore, unless you talk to grandfathers and great-grandfathers. People who call themselves left have got nothing in common with the left. And then gradually, as the left left, that's a new expression, left. So you began to also have a situation where the right itself began to lose its way. And I think what's interesting is under those circumstances, what has happened is that the definition of political divisions between left and right, which was historically the defining feature of European politics, changed to the division between the elites and populism. So the anti-populist and the populist distinction is the fundamental pivot on which political life turns in European society. I think that's really important to realize. It's not the left and the right anymore, it's the anti-populists and the populists. And the anti-populist camp, they don't call themselves that, except that's really what they are, essentially has decided and has understood that unless they do something serious, their problems is going to become even greater than ever before. And that's not a really good thing. Anyway, I don't talk about, when I think of populism, I don't think of populism as an ideology. Populism isn't like a codified outlook, right? There isn't like a book or a manifesto of populism anywhere, as far as I'm aware. Because I said earlier on, very often it's the opponents of populism that get to decide what populism is. I like to think of the spirit of populism, a kind of zeitgeist phenomenon, which is really summed up by the expression, the populist moment. And what that really expresses is that many of the things that we couldn't say beforehand, or could only whisper to each other in private company, but couldn't really flaunt in public life, is now in the air. It is now part of the consciousness of our society. Many of the things that we thought were gone forever suddenly changes. So I go to Oxford University and I talk to people, and I'm surprised to find that some of the smart kids in Oxford have decided to become Catholics. I don't know why. Why not just Catholics, but Dominicans. I don't know why. But that's what they think is really their way of expressing their idealism. In a different world, they would have joined the Communist Party or a Trotskyist party or something even to the left of that. But there's a different ways in which a lot of people are trying to find meaning in life. And what populism does, and this is for me what's really attractive about it, is that populism and its spirit represents an antidote to the cultural uncertainty, the alienation, the kind of estrangement that's imposed upon our world. Think of populism as somehow a solution or an attempted solution to the feeling of cultural loss. When you feel lost somehow, when somehow you're struggling to gain meaning in your life, when the meaning in your life is not something that you can realize through just basically adopting a lifestyle for a couple of months, but you're looking for something a little bit deeper than that. And that depth of meaning that you're looking for is actually something that a lot of populists are unable to express, but my job is to help them express it for them, is actually a search for a home. I mean, that's why it's not an ideology. Populism, to me, in the way that I see it, represents a demand to belong, a desire for belonging, a desire to feel really at home somewhere, in a world where there is very little possibility for a lot of people to feel that. Very, very often, a lot of people feel that, first of all, their home, their community, no longer looks like the way it did. You know, I know, for example, when I talk to my wife, who's English, who was born in Midlands in England, then moved down to the south. When I talk to my wife, she says the only time I feel at home is when I go to Hungary. And I says, well, why is that? Because you don't speak a word of Hungarian. You know, how could you feel at home in Hungary? And she says it's because people behave the way they used to behave in my childhood. And what she's really getting at is that there are certain connections. We use the word solidarity, where basically we are continually struggling to connect with one another, and that connection is ideologically and intellectually supported, that are possible in some parts of the world, but become very difficult to realize in another. I always think of the United States as being an extreme example of this. In the United States, we have a phenomenon in many communities which we call neighborhoods without neighbors. Neighborhoods without neighbors. And what that means is that although you occupy the same geographical space, right, you live in the same building even, actually the person that lives there is somebody you don't know. Right? You asked, and it happens in Brussels. I was talking to somebody the day before yesterday, and the person said, I don't know what would happen to me if I died, because I don't even know the name of the person who's living on my floor. I don't know who they are or what they really are about. And I'm just saying this because this is a symptom of this loss of solidarity. And that loss of solidarity is not an accident, because once you pathologize the community, once you think that localism is a bad thing, once you pathologize the nation and think that national identity is a really bad thing, what you've done in effect is you've taken away people's home in its proper, that's homeland in its proper sense. And that seems to me to be something that only populism has an answer to. Neither the conservatives at the moment, who are too scared to call themselves nationalists, nor the liberals, nor any of them, are even prepared to ask the question, to explore the question, than to basically deal with that. I want to end by saying that, for me, the most important thing about populism is voice. Voice. Have you noticed that very often, when there is an election, and they take opinion polls before the election, they always underestimate the number of people who vote for the right. They get surprised, like Brexit. You know, some of us could feel in our hearts that Brexit would win. You didn't need to have a professional pollster to tell us that. But the polls said, no, Brexit was going to lose. Trump's election in 2016, everybody is surprised and shocked that Trump wins. Time and time again, they underestimate the number of people that support the right. And the reason for that is because a lot of people are too shy or too scared to tell the pollsters what they really believe. And we're finding that there's an expression we use in England called the shy Tory, the shy conservative, who are not prepared to tell their neighbors or their friends and their colleagues exactly what they are. But that shyness is much, much wider than that. And today, less and less people are shy. Less and less people are inhibited about saying what they really feel or what they're about. And I think it's this impulse to give people voice that's really quite important. I was reading a book by this French right-wing intellectual called Renaud Camus. And he uses the expression of people being wordless, not having words. And he says, the experience of Hitler leaves Europeans wordless. Just try to pronounce the word homeland, inheritance, tradition, ancestors, root, heritage, or us, and you will be laughed at. Now, he wrote this a few years ago, and I think that what he said was very, very true at the time that he wrote this. But today, more and more of us can talk about our roots, more and more of us can talk about our ancestors, more and more of us can talk about the fact that we take our traditions very, very seriously, and that, to me, is an important development, because it means that gradually people are finding their voice. And that's what democracy is about. You know, democracy is not a play that you watch in the audience, and there are actors kind of playing a role in front of you. Democracy, from the ancient Athenian moment onwards, has always saw the need for the people to actually have a say in what's going on, at least people having the right to express their views and debate and argue against one another. These things are really quite important in a sense. And I think that what populism has done is given the people a voice. What that means, and this is the good news, is that it's inconceivable, it's out of the question, that the cordon sanitaire around the populists, the far right, or what they call all kinds of bad names, that cordon sanitaire cannot hold for very long. Because once people raise their voice and express really what they want and what they're all about, then it seems to me that that's the end of this post-war settlement which centrist and managerial technocrats were able to dominate and run. That is an important development. And now we're in a world where we are at a moment where we can actually see a new political cycle kicking in and playing an important role. There's one problem. And the problem is that to capture the spirit of populism, we need to be able to have the intellectual and the organizational resources to capture that spirit of populism. And as we capture it, give that spirit of populism a political form that expresses the needs of people today. I think it's also important that we, as we become stronger and more popular and more bold and brave, it's very, very important that we don't make the mistake of abandoning any of the values that are central to a democratic way of life. We have to have the moral high ground where we protect freedom, everybody's freedom. We have to maintain the moral high ground by taking tolerance really, really seriously and not just giving up on that. And most important of all, democracy demands that we live democratically. Democracy isn't about just voting. It means living democratically. So the spirit of populism is something that we can hand on as our inheritance to the generations to follow. Thank you.